My name is Katerina, I'm 21, and I'm kind of from all over, but I'm currently living in Langley Park, Maryland with my boyfriend. I've been watching your videos since forever, and I love your voice so much and it helps me get to sleep most nights, but I always found myself hoping that I'd never have a reason to write to you. It always struck me as a little tasteless and voyeuristic that I was vicariously experiencing other people's traumas, but like I read in one story, I suppose it serves as a kind of therapy. If it wasn't for their horrible experiences and taking the time to write it all down, I wouldn't be able to have listened to all the stories I had, and that's why it made me feel a bit guilty for enjoying your channel so much while also praying that I never suffered anything similar. Well, I did, and so now I'm sending this in to you. And what I'm studying at the University of Maryland is kind of unconventional, but that's totally irrelevant to the story. The only thing that's important to know is that because I chose it at the very last minute, I didn't exactly get my first choice of accommodation. I knew that I'd have to live with a roommate, and while the university could guarantee that she'd at least be female, I had no way of knowing if we'd be a good fit or not. I actually prayed the roomie that I ended up with would be a good match, and at first, I thought my prayers were answered. The first time I met Aubrey, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. She had strawberry blonde hair, bright brown eyes, and it was blatantly obvious from her clothes and possessions that her favorite color was pink. The first words out of my mouth were, "Oh my God, pink is my favorite color too." And when she squealed and hugged me, I just knew that we were going to be best friends. She was super nice to me, and she asked about my background, and she said that she loved my accent, which is like uber messed up, which made me feel super welcome too. Living with Aubrey proved just as much fun as I thought it was going to be, and while she certainly liked to party, she helped ensure that our apartment was a peaceful place of study and relaxation. She was fun, and unlike a lot of other college girls, she was definitely education-oriented, as opposed to socially oriented, which was the exact kind of lifestyle I wanted to avoid. But we still needed to relax after a long week, so every Friday or Saturday, depending on when we were each free, we'd get our hands on a bottle of wine and then practice being wine moms over some episodes of Gilmore Girls or Grey's Anatomy. That became something of a routine for us, but we always had to fit our wine mom sessions around Aubrey's weekend meetups with her boyfriend. Aubrey's boyfriend, Nick, seemed like a really great guy, and I didn't really expect anything less from a girl like Aubrey. She gave off such soft vibes, and he totally matched them by being ultra sweet to Aubrey, as well as super nice and gentlemanly with me, too. It got to the point where I was very grateful that I'd been placed with someone so nice. I'd heard some real horror stories about psychos making the lives of their roommates a living hell, and I genuinely thought that I'd dodged that bullet. But little did I know, moving into that on-campus apartment meant that I was about to become the star of my very own horror movie. And so, like I said, Aubrey and I had our regular wine mom nights at least once every 2 weeks or so. We decided to start watching that show, Only Murderers in the Building, so I was super excited to sit down and get tipsy and watch the first couple of episodes with her. We talked about it all week, and Aubrey herself had seemed super up for it. But then literally just hours before we were due to crack open another bottle of white wine that somebody was able to get us, she hits me with the bad news. Her boyfriend had his schedule messed up at the last minute, and he was away the following weekend, so it was either rearrange or have a date night that night, or not see each other for like 2 weeks. I totally understood her situation, so I told her to go see her boyfriend and we could just arrange to watch our show another time. She thanked me, gave me a big hug, and then ran off to get ready for her date night. Aubrey said her boyfriend was coming to pick her up at around 7, so around 6:30, I ordered some sushi from this good sushi place off campus and then waited to line my stomach with a little before I started that drinking. Now around 7, Aubrey said her boyfriend was running a little late, so we each had a small glass before her boyfriend called to announce that he was outside. She gave me another hug, told me to have fun watching whatever, then she headed out for what I assumed would be the whole night. I finished my first glass of wine, then headed back into our kitchen to grab another. I'd eaten maybe half my sushi platters, so I was ready for a larger glass. Then after fixing one, I went back to watch some more Gilmore Girls, tipsily singing along with their theme tune in a way that I'm glad no one was around to see or hear. I finished off the first glass watching Rory fretting over her Yale application, then poured myself another. But just a few sips into that third glass and I started to feel a bit sick. I thought I'd just eaten too much sushi and that it wasn't mixing well with the wine, but if that was the case, then all I had to do was slow down a bit and let it digest a little before going back to drinking. I expected that feeling of nausea to subside within maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but by that point, I felt way worse, and not just nauseous either. I felt really woozy and even shaky too. It got to the point where I thought that maybe I'd eaten some bad sushi or that I was maybe just reacting badly to the alcohol. I'd had that happen before, not with sushi but with something else, and in the end, I decided that the solution was to just make myself puke. Not the most glamorous or attractive solution, but at least that first time it had worked like a charm. It still was kind of gross afterwards, but I think doing so meant that I dodged a bout of food poisoning perhaps, because afterwards I slept it off and felt fine when I woke up in the morning. I went to the bathroom, stuck my fingers down my throat and puked up a ton of half-digested sushi and wine. It was vile, but I figured it was just a matter of time before I started feeling better, now that I'd gotten it out of my system. Now, thankfully, I did feel a little bit better, but the wine and nausea had really taken it out of me, and I felt super sleepy, but having had a very long and tiring week, I didn't think too much of it and decided to take a nap for a few hours. And after that, if I felt better, I could order some more food, maybe that wasn't poisoning me, then perhaps finish off that wine if I felt up to it. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and went to bed at around 8:30 p.m. with my alarm set to go off 2 hours from then. Just after 10 p.m., I thought I just woke up naturally, and when I saw my phone said 10:03, I rolled over and figured that I'd catnap for the remaining 20 minutes or so. But then I heard voices coming from the hallway outside. It was Aubrey and her boyfriend Nick, but instead of heading to the kitchen or the TV room or to Aubrey's bedroom, they stopped outside mine and started whispering to each other. At first, I didn't find that very alarming. I didn't expect them to come back to the apartment for any reason, but I figured they had a perfectly good reason too. I mean, they were being quiet. They must have known that I was in my bedroom trying to sleep, so I actually felt super appreciative that they were trying to keep the noise down. But then, I heard what they were saying, and it made me feel sick in a whole other kind of way. At first I heard Nick asking Aubrey in a very serious way if she was sure. He kept asking over and over, "Are you sure? Are you sure though? Aubrey, listen to me, are you sure?" And she was saying something like, "Yes, I'm sure. She was drinking when I left, and half the bottle is gone now." I was still feeling kind of groggy, so at first it didn't click why Aubrey was talking about me drinking. But then, as the conversation started to unfold, I started to get why I'd been feeling not only sick, but sleepy too. Nick asked Aubrey if she put all of something in the bottle, and Aubrey said yes. Nick then asked if she was sure that I drank at least half the bottle, and again, Aubrey said yes. She said we'd only shared a small glass each before she'd slipped it in the bottle. She promised I'd be passed out, that I wouldn't wake up, and that if they did it properly, then no one would ever find out. And that was when I realized what they were talking about. I just still didn't quite believe it yet. Never before had I experienced a moment where I thought, this cannot be happening. This has to be a nightmare. But I had one right then. I didn't pinch myself, but I had this distinct memory of telling myself, this is real. How that terrified me beyond anything I'd ever been through before. I heard Aubrey and Nick talking a little more, but I couldn't make out what they were saying until I heard them say, "I love you" to each other. I heard "I love you," then Nick's much deeper voice softly saying, "I love you too," and then my bedroom door handle started to turn. I sat up in bed, too tired and stunned to do anything but watch as my door started to open. It was still dark, so they couldn't see me sat up in bed, and then after Nick asked, "Should I turn the light on?" he flicked the switch, and they saw that I was awake. They froze, just like I was, but unlike them, I had tears in my eyes. That level of betrayal, that level of deception and predatory behavior, it wasn't just terrifying, it was heartbreaking. There was a time when I thought Aubrey and I might be friends forever, a long, long time, in a way that adults talk about their old college friends with this boundless affection. But all her warmness, the way she made me feel so welcome, it was all a lie. And after what seemed like much longer, but was probably maybe only a second of staring at one another, Nick says, "Hey, how's it going?" If that sounds like it might have been like a regular greeting, it wasn't. It was awkward, drawn out, which is why I typed out the words the way I did just then. He was clearly caught completely off guard, and as he stepped back away from the light switch, Aubrey stepped past him and into the room. She told me they just wanted to check on me, that it wasn't like me to go to bed early, and that they just wanted to make sure I was okay. Aubrey also tried to put on a very normal front, but she too had clearly not expected me to be awake. I told her I was fine, that I was just tired after a long day and that I'd like to be left alone so I could get some sleep. I wanted to confront them. I wanted that more than anything, but right at the front of my mind was the thought of what they might do if they got scared that I might call the cops. It didn't feel like the right thing to do in the moment because every fiber of my being was screaming out for me to run, to fight, to hide, whatever it took to get the hell away from them. But that feeling of being outnumbered, of knowing that I was already vulnerable from how woozy and tired I was, I knew that there was no other option than to be as non-confrontational as possible. I tried my best to put on a happy face and pretend everything was normal, because I knew my safety hinged on them believing they'd gotten away with trying to roofie me. I didn't feel even remotely safe until I saw the worried look leave Aubrey's eyes and she smiled. She said she and Nick had stopped by to grab some of her clothes because she was staying overnight at his place, and then told me to call her if I needed anything. I thanked her, asked her to turn the light back off on her way out, and then she and Nick left the apartment, with me huddled under my blankets, hand over my mouth and trying not to let them hear me cry. I was young, naive, and scared for my life, and while the logical thing would have been to call the cops, I was focused on finding someone that I could stay with, who could come and get me out of there immediately, which is how I ended up calling the guy who ended up becoming my current boyfriend. We'd been hanging out, not quite dating, not quite being just friends. I liked him and I trusted him enough to call him for help, but I also didn't want to tell him what I suspected was happening either. I just told him it was an emergency, I needed help, and I needed it to arrive faster than the cops would. He then drove over, half carried me to his car, and then stayed at his place that night without him having any clue what was happening. He later said that he figured that I was just drunk and upset about something, and I only found out what was happening when I called the cops in his apartment. When I mentioned that I suspected my roommate and her boyfriend had drugged me, his jaw dropped, and I remember him just pacing back and forth in disbelief. The dispatcher recommended that I go to the hospital if I was still feeling nauseous, and I later learned that the major danger involved passing out and then choking on your own vomit. But I told her that I didn't think that was necessary, and that I'd managed to purge what was in my stomach before whatever it was managed to take its full effect, I think. And then the dispatcher then asked if I was able to meet a pair of police officers back at the apartment. I told her yes. She gave me a little info on what to expect, and then me and my current boyfriend drove back over to the place that I'd just been drugged. Driving away, I'd been terrified, but driving back felt different. I hoped with all my heart that Aubrey and Nick had been stupid enough to return to that apartment, because that way I might get to see them in cuffs for what they'd done to me. But that was wishful thinking on my part, because when we walked inside, they were nowhere to be found, but neither was the bottle of wine that I'd been drinking from. The two cops we met up with had been very interested in getting their hands on it, but Aubrey and Nick had been smart enough to leave with it. They had suspected that I had known what they were doing, and like any truly devious criminals, they tried their best to hide the evidence. But the evidence they couldn't hide, at least, that it was way too late to hide, was the evidence in my blood and urine, I thought I had them, because I knew whatever they'd slipped me was certain to show up on a drug test if I got one fast enough. I told the cops that's what I was planning to do, but one took me aside and broke some very horrifying truth to me. Without direct surveillance of the kitchen and without the tainted wine and bottle as evidence, there was very little chance that my case would even make it to trial. They could go search Aubrey's room. They could go search Nick's stuff too, but if they suspected that I might be onto them, the chances of the cops finding anything was extremely slim. They had already successfully disposed of one piece of that evidence, so it was unlikely that they'd leave others just lying around for police to find. The cop told me that the single best piece of advice that he could give me was to find somewhere else to stay, move my stuff out, and never associate myself with Aubrey again. I was horrified. I couldn't believe a cop would take such a cynical approach to enforcing the law, but looking back on it, he was entirely correct. I insisted that he and his partner search Aubrey's room for any trace of roofies or maybe GHB or whatever it was they gave me, but they found nothing, just like that one cop said they wouldn't. I later heard that the cops had searched Nick's place too, and since he fully cooperated during the search, he had more than likely scrubbed his apartment of anything remotely incriminating. And that was one of the worst parts of the whole ordeal, knowing that we were going to get away with what they did, and how it probably wasn't the first time they tried to do something like that. Aubrey didn't come back to campus this year, at least it's been weeks, and I haven't seen her around yet, so I'm assuming that she dropped out for some reason. And that's fine by me. I hope she's gone for good, and if she has, I can say with absolute certainty that this year, campus is a much, much safer place without Aubrey and Nick being around. Back in the summer of 2008, I was 20 years old, living with my mom, and I was getting really bloody sick of it. My mom and I had always gotten along very well, but it was around that time that our lifestyles became totally incompatible, and it started to put a bit of strain on our relationship. I remember buying a copy of our local newspapers, looking through the listings, and then coming to a bit of a depressing realization. If I wanted to stay in the area, in a flat that was actually nice, it was going to take a huge chunk out of my monthly earnings. That was doable, but only just, so if I wanted to have any kind of disposable income, I was going to have to search for a potential flatmate. And that is when I thought of Andrew. Andrew had been hanging around with me and my close circle of friends for about a year. A mutual friend had introduced us, and since we shared a lot of common interests, he became a regular feature on our nights out and pub sessions. He always seemed like an alright lad to me, definitely a bit weird, but we were all a bit weird in our own way. And by the time I started looking for flats, Andrew was sleeping on a mutual friend's bedroom floor after being kicked out of his mom and stepdad's house. We asked him why he'd been kicked out, and he told us it was because of a fight that he'd had with his stepdad. They'd gotten into a heated discussion. They'd squared up to one another, then, as Andrew put it, he battered him. This fit right into the evil step-parent stereotype for us, and since most of our social circle were children of divorce, not only did we never question it, but we also kind of applauded it. We thought that he was hard as nails for taking on a stepdad like that, so our mutual friend had zero problem giving Andrew a place to stay, even if that meant sharing a bedroom, and I had no problem vouching for him so he could get a job working for the same company I was. He had some income, and he needed a place to stay, so to me, Andrew was the natural choice to be my new flatmate. I asked him what he thought, and as you can imagine, he was buzzing at the idea of having his own place. He didn't have any money to cover his half of the deposit, but I told him that didn't matter. All he needed to do was give me half the rent at the end of every month, and I'd cover bills and council tax until he got more hours at the bar that I'd found him a job at. And then, once he could afford it, he could fork over more money for the bills, etc. And we agreed on a handshake that this was the arrangement, and then I placed some calls to prospective landlords and eventually found us a decent place in the exact area that I was hoping for. The first month of living with Andrew was actually awesome. It was the first time both of us had lived in our very own apartment, so we were both buzzing for the first week or so, but then after falling into the routine of living with Andrew, I couldn't see any problems on the horizon. He paid his share of the rent on time, he tidied up after himself, and he kept the noise down in his room whenever I needed to sleep. And then aside from that, he was pretty good fun to chill with. We'd like the same kind of movies, the same kind of music, and the same kind of food, so there wasn't really anything for us to disagree about. This obviously suited me down to the ground, and I felt like a proper big brain having picked the smartest choice for a flatmate. But then, I started to notice that things weren't quite as they seemed. So the only major difference between mine and Andrew's job was that I used to work much later than him. He'd finish at around 2 in the morning, whereas my place stayed open till 5 a.m. Sometimes Andrew would pop by for a drink and to spend his tips, but most times he went straight home, which is what happened the night that I came home and found one of his weekly pay slips on the table. I know it's not cricket for a man to look at another man's pay stub, but it was right there on the table as I sat down to eat my post-work meal. And I thought that I had a good idea of the hours that he was getting, so the figure on the pay slip should have been somewhere in the region of maybe 150 to 200. But instead of anything near to that amount, the figure said, and I'll always remember this, 37 pounds and 38 pence. I remember that figure because I stared at that pay slip in utter disbelief for a good few minutes, wondering where he was getting his money from. He was spending like an absolute sailor, and although he made a pretty penny in tips, it wasn't enough to go throwing it around like he was. But then by far the most confusing part for me was he'd be out 4 times that previous week, the week the slip was dated for, and each time he was dressed for work and didn't say anything to me about not going to work before he headed out. Like if he had been hanging around the flat on the days that he should have been working, it'd have cottoned on to the fact that he wasn't working enough to cover the rent. But he'd gone out 4 times, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and each time he'd been wearing his black work shirt and dress shoes. I didn't want to confront him about it. I mean, I shouldn't have been looking at his pay slip to begin with, but I also couldn't help but worry that he might not have his share of rent come the end of the month. But then, when the end of the month came, and he had all the money, I forgot all about it. Could have been a mistake on the company payroll, or maybe he made the hours up the following week. Either way, we had the rent, so I wasn't fussed about it. But looking back on it, that was the first big sign that something was wrong. The next big sign that Andrew wasn't the good guy we all thought he was when he started going out with a girl named Julia. Now Julia, not her actual name, but she was a nice girl, quite shy and reserved, but very pretty. I'd seen her around, but had never really spoke to her outside of serving her a drink until she and Andrew started seeing each other. But then I was waiting in the queue at the 24-hour McDonald's looking to get a bit of food after work, when who should walk in after her own shift had finished but Julia. She knew me from being Andrew's flatmate, so we got chatting about this and that and the other. But during our first small talk-oriented conversation, she mentioned something that pricked my ears up. For some reason, even though Andrew was just a low-level bar back at the place that he worked, Julia seemed to think that he was an assistant manager. It came up when she said something like, "Well, I know Andrew's just gotten that AM job at the Drexel Lounge, so we haven't had a chance to see each other in a few weeks." I remember saying something like, okay, yeah, sorry to hear that, and then I moved the conversation on. What I should have done in retrospect is tell Julia that no, Andrew isn't an assistant manager and he's not been busy. He's been lazing around the flat on his 3 days off a week. But to be honest, learning that Andrew had told Julia that he was an assistant manager took me totally by surprise. I knew it was a lie. There was no way Andrew had been promoted to assistant manager on 20-something hours a week, especially not after having worked there for all of 3 to 4 months. I just didn't want her to find out that it was a lie from me. And that probably sounded incredibly selfish, keeping Julia in the dark like that so I could avoid being the one to break the news to her. But I was also still very much Andrew's friend at this point, so I also wanted to give him a chance to do the right thing. which, looking back on it, was about as pointless as a screen door on a submarine, as they say. I won't go into the entire exchange because it'd take about 10 pages to get it all down on paper, but the long and the short of it was this. Andrew had lied to Julia, through his bloody teeth as well, and all just to impress her into sleeping with him. Then, when he couldn't be arsed to see her anymore, he fobbed her off with lies about being busy with all his new training and responsibilities. He'd taken poor little Julia, who'd never have said boo to a goose, and then pumped and dumped her. And what's worse, he was bloody proud of it too. And I was horrified. Now I know that might sound a bit snowflakey, but I really was. I had no idea Andrew was capable of something so manipulative. But when I expressed even the slightest disapproval, he acted like I was threatening to call the police or something. He says, "That's what everyone does. You tell a few fibs to impress him, she's not going to be impressed if I tell her I'm a freaking barback, is she?" I understand that twisted logic, but what I didn't understand is why he felt so comfortable lying about something that Julia was bound to learn the truth about eventually. And to my amazement, the idea that Julia might visit him at work seemed genuinely novel to Andrew, and for just the briefest of moments, I saw this flicker of fear in his eyes. But then, he sort of pulled himself together, shrugged off what he was saying, and told me that she'd never found out because of X, Y, and Z reasons. The main being that his wasn't the kind of bar that she liked to drink in. I remember dying to be like, unless I bloody well tell her. But as much as this just sounds cowardly in retrospect, I just didn't want the smoke with my new flatmate. He'd been a prick, but I still don't think it was entirely my responsibility to go righting wrongs when I firmly believed the karmic wheel would eventually come spinning around to smash him in the face. And so, I kept my mouth shut about it. At least, for a while, I did. Remember I said Andrew was a decent flatmate, and that he always cleaned up after himself and kept the place looking decent? Well, that didn't last more than about 4 months because, slowly but surely, his hygiene standards started to slip. I won't go into all the boring stuff about him leaving dishes out and whatnot, so I'll just cut to the part when I realized why Andrew had never, ever brought a girl back to his flat. I'd never been in his room. I'd never needed to, and since his door was further down the corridor than mine, I never got a look in while walking past either. I'd seen the room when we first moved in, but after that, I just never needed to. There was a bit of bro code going on, like young men who lived together learn very quickly not to just barge into each other's bedrooms. And that's why I hadn't even had a peep in his bedroom in almost 150 days at this point. So when I finally did take a look into Andrew's room, my jaw hit the floor. I was quite naive in that when I first became aware of Andrew's casual relationship with the truth, I thought, nah, he wouldn't try and lie to me like that. But shock and horror, he did, and sometimes he did so in the twattiest of ways. Like one day when I couldn't find my iPhone charger plug and I asked if he'd borrowed it, he swore up and down that he hadn't touched it, and so just on a whim, I decided to check his bedroom just in case he'd quote-unquote borrowed it and then forgotten to replace it. I literally thought to myself as I was walking down the corridor, I wonder what he's done with the place. But when I opened that door, I swear I was almost knocked off my feet. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was disgusting in there, and I suddenly realized where some of our cups and plates had gone. They'd been in his bedroom, scattered around the place with scraps of moldy food left on them, and they'd been there for weeks. There were piles of stinking clothes all over the place. His mirror literally had splatter marks on it from where he'd been popping zits, and I saw a not entirely empty bottle of beer that had been there so long, the dregs in the bottom had gone moldy. And those, boys and girls, were just a few of the stomach-churning delights that I got to witness as I cautiously tread through Andrew's room, treating each suspiciously stiff-looking sock like it was an actual friggin' landmine. I found my iPhone charger's plug. He had taken it, but instead of texting him saying something like, "You prick, you took it," my mind was so blown seeing how he lived that it knocked me for 6. I couldn't believe that he lived like that, and I couldn't believe that I'd been sleeping in the next room over completely none the wiser. I thought Andrew not bringing girls back was, I don't know, like a sign of respect or something. We talked about not being a party house, so I thought that was him holding up his end of the bargain. But it wasn't that. It was because his room was an effing pigsty. In fact, I take that back. It's an insult to pigs. It was more like it was a rubbish dump. If he wanted to have his room like that, fine, but as I said earlier, the issue was that his lack of hygiene was encroaching on the rest of the flat. But then, when I brought this up with him, it caused a bit of an argument. He thought that I was being majorly uptight, explained that he was exhausted and I shouldn't start having a go at him over a few unwashed plates in the sink. I didn't even bring up the state of his room. I didn't want the argument to escalate any further than it had. I'd started to think there might actually be something wrong with Andrew, something he maybe needed help with, and as his friend, that's all I really wanted. But still, the incident marked the beginning of a strain that never ended, but rather got worse and worse and worse. Again, I won't bore you with each little chapter in the breakdown of our friendship. You've already heard most of the significant stuff anyways. But when things came to a head, they came to a head in a big way. We'd moved in together during early August of 2008, and by February of 2009, we were barely talking to each other. Andrew had only contributed half of what he'd promised for February's rent, leaving me no choice but to spot him the rest until he got paid at his new job, which he'd only been forced to seek out after most likely getting sacked from his first job, but that's a story for another day. I wasn't angry that I had to spot him. I was angry because he knew that if I didn't, we'd both get kicked out of that flat, not just him. He knew I had no choice, and so he took full advantage of it. I'm not saying that was scary, I'm just saying you can understand why. By early February, mine and Andrew's friendship was teetering on knife's edge. And then one Wednesday night, it was coming up to about 2 a.m., when into my bar walks Andrew's new colleagues. I noticed their slug and lettuce uniforms and rightly assumed that they were his fellow bar staff coming in for a drink after work. They walked up to the bar. I went over to serve them, then once their order was assembled and I told them the price, one of them asked, "Hey, you're Ralph, right, aren't you?" I nodded, at which point the same girl said, "Oh, we work with Andrew." But despite me still wanting payment, no one so much as budged to grab a card, a banknote from their purses or wallets. I was like, "Okay, good for you, but I still need payment for these drinks." And when I said that, the Slug and Lettuce staff started acting all confused. They told me Andrew had said that if they came into my bar and found me in particular, I'd give them free drinks. All I did was roll my eyes and tell them something like, "Oh, it sounds just like Andrew. All talk and it's all bollocks." Because I was just so over his stupid, petty lies to people. But me talking badly of him seemed to cause some deep offense in Andrew's new colleagues. They didn't say anything, they just kind of looked at each other, paid for the drinks, and then off they went. But then a few rounds later, and maybe an hour had gone by, I went over to serve them a second time. I brought them their drinks, and that time had no trouble getting the payment. But as I was ringing them up, one of the girls asked me if I liked living with Andrew. I was just very honest with them, told them I wasn't loving it, but said nothing more than that. Then once again, they acted like some grave offense had been committed. The same girl told me, "You should be more grateful for what he's done for you." Which honestly made me laugh out loud because what the bloody hell had he been telling them? Well, it turns out, Andrew had been telling them an awful lot about me, and not a single word of it was true. Andrew had told his new colleagues that it was him that had rescued me from being homeless. He'd also claimed that it was him, and not me, that was taking care of most of the bills, and that I couldn't work more than 30 hours a week because I had chronic fatigue syndrome. And because of this chronic fatigue, Andrew had told his colleagues about how I had trouble cleaning up after myself, and that he spent a great deal of time making sure that I had a nice, clean place to live. And so in their view, me expressing anything but eternal gratitude to Andrew was grossly offensive and extremely unappreciative. They told me all that in a very accusatory fashion, as in they thought that they were going to give me a proper telling off, and I was going to be all ashamed of myself for being an ingrate. But that's not how things went down, and instead of just having a go at them, I told my manager I was heading out for a quick smoke before closing. It wasn't that busy by then, and then asked the girl who had done most of the accusation to come outside for a polite word. Now, looking back on it, I think she had her own doubts about Andrew. If that was me and I thought the disrespectful ingrate of a flatmate was just going to defame my colleague, I'd never have given them the time of day. But she came outside and actually heard me out, and while I explained how almost everything she had been told was a lie, I broke down everything for her, in intimate detail too. But at the end of the day, it was all just words. Me saying that, no, Andrew didn't work part-time for a homelessness charity, was very confusing for her. It was a case of a he said, she said situation, and without going away to actually fact-check all of the things he'd said, all I'd done was leave her in a sort of haze of confusion. The thing that really drove the point home and made her realize just what a liar Andrew was seeing a photograph of his bedroom. I've been talking to my mom about Andrew's situation, not necessarily just complaining about him either, like I genuinely wanted her advice. Andrew had been really annoying to me, but he was still a friend, and his behavior seemed way beyond just laziness or arrogance. Like I thought there was genuinely something wrong with him and that it was up to his close friends to maybe do something about it. I brought up his bedroom, and like everyone else I mentioned it to, they simply did not believe it was as bad as I said it was until I showed them. I had taken a picture of his room to show my mom how I was not in fact exaggerating the situation, and that Andrew's room was in such a state that I was legitimately worried about his health. But when his new colleague accused me of being the resident slob, I felt that I had very little choice but to show her the picture, if only to salvage my own reputation among a group of potentially regular customers, I guess. Needless to say, she was horrified. And before some of you go asking, well, how did she know it was actually Andrew's room? Well, let's just say there are a few solid indicators that it was definitely his room. For example, Andrew was a big Metallica fan and there was a big Black Album poster on his wall. Andrew also smoked drum-rolling tobacco at the time, and at least a dozen of the distinct blue packets could be seen strewn around his room. And if you knew Andrew and saw that photo, you just knew that that was his bedroom. And for the girl that had done the accusing, it was deeply shocking for her. I mean, it'd be shocking for anyone to find out that loads of what they've been told is a complete lie. But this girl seemed way worse than just surprised. She seemed well and truly devastated. I remember before she left, she asked me one more time if I knew for certain Andrew didn't volunteer with a homelessness charity, which was where he supposedly met and rescued me. I told her I was really, really sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that Andrew wasn't at all like she thought he was. I didn't think he was evil or a terrible person, but he clearly had issues with lying, and unfortunately, she'd been his latest victim, and in more ways than one. Now, if you're assuming that little revelation session would be the final nail in the coffin of mine and Andrew's friendship, well, you'd be right. He was only 2 weeks into his new job, and everyone he worked with now knew that he was a liar, and not just any liar, a very prolific one too. Then, since it was me that had spilled the beans, it caused such a big fight that we almost came to blows. It was probably one of the most interesting interactions I ever had with Andrew, because I realized that he had told so many lies that he actually lost track of what he'd said to who. Again, I won't bore you by typing out the entire exchange, but there was a point that I realized that he'd almost completely lost track of his lies, but instead of having any kind of come-to-Jesus moment, realizing he was exposed just made Andrew angrier and angrier. As I said, we never came to fighting, but it certainly bloody looked like we would for a hot minute. About a week after that big fight, I came home from work to discover that Andrew had gone out but had left his keys in the flat. And by then he owed me hundreds of pounds in rent, and with my name the only one on the lease, there was absolutely zero incentive for me to just let him back in. I told him to go stay with his mom. And long story, but that whole getting kicked out situation had been another lie, and that when he had the money he owed me, he would come and collect his stuff following an amicable exchange. He actually got his mom to call me up at some point, basically to beg for his stuff back on his behalf, but after telling her the whole truth, she took my side and agreed that Andrew needed to pay me what I was owed. I actually told her on the phone I'll happily just pawn all of his stuff to get some money back, but I'd rather just box things off like gentlemen and not have to lug his gear to cash converters. And you know what she said? "That's fair enough, Ralph. I'll get Andrew to give you a call." But he never did phone me back because Andrew had some much more pressing issues at hand. I had no idea that those issues even existed until much later on, so instead of telling now, I think I'll keep you in the dark until we reach the climax of our little story here, which I'll share with you now. So one night, I get ready to leave for work, and as I walk out into the street outside my flat, I see a car's headlights flash on. I didn't think anything of it, not right away. But then, as I walked away from the car toward the main road where my bus stop was, I saw the lights behind me getting brighter and brighter, and I realized the car wasn't trying to pass me in the street. I realized that it was coming up directly behind me, and it was moving fast, too. Thankfully, the penny dropped before it was too late for me to do anything, and I was able to simply jump back onto someone's front path as the car went speeding past me on the pavement. It only narrowly missed slamming into a lamppost, and at first it was almost inconceivable that the car had actually tried to run me over. I just thought it was some overly aggressive driver in a terrible mood or something, but then I recognized who was in the driver's seat. It was Andrew. He got out of the driver's seat, with the car still mounted on the pavement with its engine running, and then walked around to the boot to open it. And by then I'm shouting, "Are you for real? You just tried to run me over, yeah? Are you mental?" Andrew doesn't say anything. He just opens up the car boot, takes out a golf club of some description, and then starts walking up our neighbor's path toward me. I have this real oh bollocks moment when I realized he actually wanted to do me some serious damage. The only method I had of defending myself was to pull out the little penknife attached to my bartender's friend, which was barely an inch long, and wave it around like a mental person in the hopes that it would deter him. It did, a little bit, but since he had about 3 foot of swing to that golf club, he knew that he had the advantage, and so as he got closer, he started trying to bash my head in with it. All the screaming immediately alerted the owner of the home, and as we're sort of back and forth dueling on their pathway, they came out to tell us to stop. But Andrew did not immediately stop, and he got at least one good strike at me, which hit me in the ribs before the homeowner's cry of, "The police are on their way," finally got him to relent. He ran to his car, sped off, and left me trembling in the woman's pathway, apologizing to her for the unexpected fight. When she found out what had happened, her reaction was next to saintly. She asked if I wanted to come in for a cup of tea while we waited for the police, and that's just what I did after calling into work to let them know that I'd be late clocking in. I thought Andrew wanted to bash me because I'd exposed his web of lies, and in a way, that's exactly what had happened. But the thing that had made him angry enough to try and kill me wasn't so much that I'd exposed him, it was the reaction of others that he'd lied to, and in particular the reaction of the female colleague who'd accused me of ingratitude. Again, I didn't find this out until maybe 2 or 3 months after he locked himself out of the flat, but by then, everyone knew what I'm about to tell you. It was practically talk of the town. So I can't speak for every country's legal system, but here in the UK, we have a crime under the statute titled violation by deception. They don't use the word violation, I'm just using it in place of another word you probably wouldn't be able to say, but I'm sure you can all work out which one I'm talking about. Anyways, the law states that, and I'm just going to copy and paste this here, violation by deception is a situation in which the perpetrator deceives the victim into participating in carnal acts that they would otherwise not have consented had they not been deceived. Deception can occur in many forms, such as illusory perceptions, false statements, and false actions. It all sounds very cut and dry. You lie to get laid, and you've committed violation by deception. But at least under English law, the criteria to achieve a conviction is, and I'm quoting legal manual here, very narrow. Essentially, the prosecution has to prove that the victim would not have slept with the perpetrator if they hadn't deceived them. So, for example, if a man refuses to pay a prostitute after he slept with her, That doesn't fall under violation by deception. But trick someone into thinking you're a completely different person to the one you are, and that could well earn a conviction. Well, Andrew had been sleeping with a female colleague who'd initially accused me, hence why she was so eager to defend her new lover. But once she realized that almost everything he told her was a lie, she was quite naturally devastated. At first, she didn't think that there was any way of getting back at him because she was totally unaware of the whole VBD law. But little did Andrew know, but his new belle was a student at Sheffield Uni, and one of her housemates and all-around best friends was a third-year law student. After a heart-to-heart about what a scumbag Andrew was, the girl's friend informed her of the whole VBD thing, and she now had some actual legal recourse to get back at him, and use it she did. Andrew was angry that I'd pulled the wool away from everyone's eyes, but the thing that made him want to kill me was the fact that telling the truth was going to potentially result in a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Andrew was arrested, released on bail, then the whole thing went to trial about 6 months later. By then, he was living with his biological dad outside the city, so no one saw him around town for the duration of the ordeal. Everyone hoped the girl and her lawyers would be able to land a conviction, and I remember reading about the trial on social media later and thinking Andrew might actually go to prison for what he'd done. But unfortunately, because Andrew pled guilty at his plea hearing, and in light of him being a first-time offender, he ended up walking away with nothing more than a suspended prison sentence of 2 years. Everyone who knew about the situation was devastated, but Andrew didn't get away scot-free. With his reputation now ruined, he was forced to move away, and although a mutual friend of ours keeps up with him from time to time, we know next to nothing about where he is or what he's doing. This is mainly because I tell this mutual friend that I don't want to know, but that doesn't stop me from thinking about Andrew from time to time. I came to learn that telling so many lies in the way that Andrew did is a sure sign of sociopathy, or in other words, Andrew had a serious case of what you might call main character syndrome, and that's why he felt so comfortable lying, because other people didn't matter to him. Even if individuals found out he was lying, there was no real loss to him because he didn't care what they thought of him in the first place. However, it's also common for people like that to highly prize their overall reputation. After all, if no one trusts you to begin with, there's no one to fool. So having me expose him, and in such a way that meant there were legal ramifications, that makes people like Andrew murderous. I sometimes wonder if, wherever Andrew went, he repeated that whole process of lying and manipulating people. And I know it sounds a bit callous, but I kinda hope he has. I hope he's completely rebuilt his life, even if it's a duplicitous house of cards, because that means he's actually moved on. And I hope that because the alternative is that he still hates me, he still gets angry thinking about me exposing him, and he's going to just wait until things have blown over, well and truly, before coming back to get his final and bloody revenge. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, they put boogers in the egg drop soup.